A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, the Horrible Deplorable, and with me as always is my friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
This is a podcast we do for the Gab community. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and the 405 Media. We play at 5 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday. All you have to do in any of those applications is to type in the Horrible Deplorable Show. We're also on YouTube. I'm hoping that if you enjoy the show, you'll recommend us to one other person. Just get a friend to listen as well, and we will grow exponentially. What to talk about this week, Doris? Let's start with the Boston Free Speech Rally.
Wow, that was something.
So on the heels of Charlottesville, some conservatives decided that they were going to hold a free speech rally to simply reestablish the point, or hopefully reestablish the point, that it's still legal to assemble in the public square in the United States and to express your opinions, even if they are unpopular opinions. And what we saw was about 24 conservatives show up, not neo-Nazis, not white nationalists, just conservatives. Even the candidate who is an Indian, Dot Not Feather, who's running against Elizabeth Warren, he showed up there, so a person of color. This was just a kind of a standard conservative rally. Tens of thousands of hysterical liberals showed up to march against the free speech rally. Also, what I thought was interesting was that the media referred to it as a free speech rally, free speech in air quotes. I'm doing air quotes. They had it in quotes, as if it was questionable whether it was an actual free speech rally. I'm wondering, when I was reading that, I was thinking, if this is an quote unquote free speech rally, what would a non-quote unquote free speech rally be?
They simply called it that because they couldn't think of anything worse to call it yet.
Well, there was obviously an expectation that this would be some kind of Nazi rally that they could push against. There was this great moment on social media where this lady, it was retweeted by the Friends of Bernie site, and she took a picture of the gazebo in the Boston Commons, which was now empty because the rally was over, and she said, "It's all over, all the Nazi flags have been torn down." And I went back to find a picture of when the rally was going on, and when the conservatives were there, they had one of those "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and then they had two American flags, one a standard and the other an older one in which the stars were in a circle. Those were the three flags that were prominent on the gazebo that apparently this woman thought were Nazi flags. And I think we just watched it just continue to get more hysterical as the week went on. We got to the point where even ESPN asked an Asian announcer of theirs named Robert Lee to not announce a game in Virginia because his name was Robert Lee.
Wow. And how common of a name is that?
Well, first of all, Lee's a very common name for Asians, and it has absolutely no connection whatsoever to do with Robert E. Lee, the general from the Confederacy. But it shows just how completely bizarre things have gotten. They jumped the shark a long time ago. They're in hysteria land. So many people are involved. This is what's called a mass hysteria. And you're actually watching one unfold in front of your eyes, folks. It's not pleasant, but, it is historically interesting. If you'll remember back to the 80s, there was a scare for a few years, which was also a mass hysteria, that somehow a bunch of child daycare centers were actually satanic cults, and that people involved in them were doing all sorts of weird sex acts and other things involved with the children. And there was the McMartin case down in Southern California, and there was another one up in Wenatchee, Washington, and there were a few others around the country in which people were arrested who were running daycare centers. The children were testifying that they had been involved in all sorts of satanic cultural rituals, and people went to jail. Some people were in jail for up to 5, 6, 7, 8 years until the court slowly but surely reversed all of these, because it was clear that a bunch of cops and social workers who were unqualified to do anything in life and had taken on social work as their occupation had basically coached these kids into saying these things. And eventually even some of these kids, when they were older teenagers, came out and said, this just never happened. I was led down the primrose path on these things. Destroyed lives, very much like the Salem witch trials of a few hundred years back. This, you're seeing one right now. This mass hysteria that anything that remotely smacks of conservative politics or pro-Trump politics or defending our monuments to the Civil War or what have you, it's all just created this Nazi-esque hysteria around one mentally ill dude running over some people. But it's mass hysteria because Antifa had been doing violence on Trump supporters for a year and a half, and that wasn't creating any mass hysteria. It's just this one trigger point, one guy committing one act of murder confirms a worldview that they had been telling themselves was true, even though they were getting no confirmation from actual events in the world until they got this one singular event. Now, we've had repeated vehicle attacks from Muslims, both in the United States and Europe, repeatedly, to the point now where it's happened almost 24 times. And that does not confirm any kind of a worldview or create any kind of mass hysteria, right? I mean, all the evidence is there to prove that this is a mass hysteria, because if this were just a reaction to this murder, you'd see 20 times that reaction to what Muslims have been doing in Europe, in the United States. But they don't react that way. Matter of fact, their reaction is exactly the opposite of calm down, everyone. Don't judge all Muslims by what one does, or 2 do, or 10 do, or 15 do. It doesn't matter how many times it repeats itself. They keep denying the pattern. But you get one professed neo-Nazi who commits an act of murder, and it's a bias that there are millions of Nazis in the country and that there's this Nazism is going to rise in the United States. Another way it's absurd is there never was a Nazi movement in the United States. This is a German phenomenon. We have a KKK history in the United States. The Democrats created that. That's long since become basically a fringe organization with very few members. I mean, you may have seen the total membership of the KKK on display in Charlottesville a couple of weeks ago. A number of those people that were there were probably self-professed white nationalists, so they weren't even KKK or Nazis. There was a picture of 2 or 3 people doing the Nazi salute. I'm betting that may be half of the entire population of Nazis in the country. 6 or 20 people who are professed Nazis who work at hamburger stands or deliver pizzas for a living is not a threat to the democracy in any way, shape, or form. But a violent, self-professed violent organization like Antifa that spends a year and a half beating up dozens of Trump supporters and going to public speeches where conservatives like Ann Coulter or Milo Yiannopoulos are going to speak and literally destroying property to shut them down, using bike locks to brain people and all of that, that actually is a real concern, especially because it gets sanctioned by the media. You have people as stupid as Mitt Romney claiming that they're the angels in this scenario, and that the handful of neo-Nazis who work at delivering pizzas and hot dog stands, that they're somehow the threat to the country. When you get that kind of backing from the elites, that's when you actually do have a dangerous organization. And I would say that the closest comparison is the KKK. A few people acting as vigilantes is not necessary. I mean, it's horrible for those that are caught up in it, but it's not a threat to the country. But the KKK was more than that. It had the backing of local officials. It had the backing, implicit backing of an entire society. A lot of people joined the KKK late in its reign, say in the teens and the 20s and 30s. It was more of a social club, and a lot of people who never even went out on midnight raids or did anything violent just joined it as a place to find a job or to network and meet other people. It was that sort of interwoven into society. There is nothing like that with the KKK or neo-Nazis in this country. They have absolutely no prominence, no connection, no sanction. But Antifa does. Antifa, if you notice, the media downplays their violence, and then you have people like Mitt Romney and others actually making excuses for them. That is the closest comparison to the KKK you can get when you have an organization that's organized, it makes public threats, it explains its reasons for doing the terrorizing that it's doing. What does this sound like? And then there's an implicit recognition in society that it's sanctioned, right? That's Antifa. And that's as close as you're going to get to what the KKK was. So handful of people committing violence or doing murder or mayhem, that's just in a country of 300 million, you're always going to have that. But the red alert is when you see people doing that and being implicitly sanctioned by our elites. And that's what's going on with Antifa, and it needs to stop. By the way, Trump's reaction to this about there's violence on both sides, it created this hysterical reaction from the media. And then, of course, Democrats just jumped on it because they're very good at politics and they know exactly when they have an issue they think they can hammer away at. Democrats are very seldom telling you the truth, especially when they're acting hysterical. They're just very good at histrionics and pretending to be outraged when they know or instinctively feel that it's going to be effective politically for them. But I think you can understand Trump's reaction if you understand that he's not hoaxed by the media. And while they downplay all the violence against Trump supporters, he actually noticed it. I believe that Trump has been keenly aware of all the violence that's been done to his supporters since he was running for office. And so he has sat there and watched dozens and dozens of people with Make America Great hats and what have you get egged and brained and get physically assaulted. You remember that video last year of that young man that was being chased down by a mob and eventually tackled? He saw all that, and I think he's been simmering about that because those are his supporters, those are his voters. You can imagine he would take that very personally, and he also sees how ignored that fact is and how it's not really being condemned and that it's sort of open season on Trump supporters, and it has been for a year and a half. So when that violence happens in Charlottesville, he has two thoughts, which I had, which was, of course, that's horrible and that murder was terrible and that person should be condemned. But he doesn't see Antifa as angels. He sees them as people coming to cause violence, and that what those folks at the Unite the Right rally were doing in most cases was probably trying to defend themselves and to give as good as they're getting in violence. So when he says there's bad people on both sides and there was violence on both sides, that's an accurate assessment. And it's coming from a man who's been watching his own supporters be bludgeoned in the streets for a year and a half. It was the reaction that I had of, these Antifa folks are not angels. They came looking for a fight and they got a fight. So two groups of detestable people mixed it up and they should both be condemned. And that's what he did. And then you have people like Mitt Romney and others coming in and saying it's not equivalent. They're not the same. As if this violence against Trump supporters for a year and a half has not been happening. But there's a clue in that, folks. I mean, think about it. People like Mitt Romney, never Trumpers, someone Trump was actually trying or considering making peace with and perhaps making his Secretary of State. This is a guy who's such a never Trumper and is waiting for this fever to break so that we'll all go away and they can have control of the party again. He also apparently has, in his own mind, been downplaying and ignoring that violence against Trump supporters. Because in order to come out and make the statement that he's made in defense of Antifa, he would have to be essentially part of this same hysteria, willfully ignoring the violence. So he doesn't look at all those Trump supporters who are, for the most part, Republicans, and he doesn't see them as his people, does he? He sees them all being violently attacked, and it doesn't offend him in any way, shape, or form.
Because they're not Romney's people, they're not his people.
I think it's very telling. Very telling. So Steve Bannon left, and I know everybody's been having reactions to that. I would boil down the reaction to Bannon's departure sort of into two camps among Trump supporters. There's this very angry reaction, or maybe I should say sort of quietly angry reaction that somehow the globalists are winning and that all of the nationalists in the Trump administration are being pushed out. Steve Miller is still there. I think there's some truth to that, but I still think that the greatest nationalist in the administration is the president himself. The other wing sort of the Trump base that's reacting to the Bannon departure is basically saying, look, he did some things to seal his own fate. He gave that interview to The Prospect, which was a very liberal organization, in which he said a bunch of things you're just not supposed to say out loud, including kind of undermining the North Korean strategy and other things. And he's been probably responsible for some leaks against his enemies in the administration, and the president has taken notice of that and wanted him out. My reaction is that both things are true. I think that Bannon did unfortunately make some very serious errors that compounded on each other, and when he already knew he was in a precarious position, he made it very difficult for them to retain him. So to some degree he brought that on himself.
So why hasn't he got along with Kushner? I think I read that Kushner was against Bannon, or was for Bannon going.
Well, I think, bear in mind that Jared and his wife Ivanka, who's Trump's daughter, are not very conservative. They're not. So they are much more like the Murdoch's sons. They travel in those social elite circles in New York, and that is a very liberal circle. And that conservatives, or even people who lean a little conservative, who travel in those circles, tend to be very quiet and to downplay their conservatism. And maybe even there's a herd mentality of sort of when the group, you can imagine at these parties and these circles that people who are actually conservative are looked down upon and treated with a lot of disdain. And I don't think that Jared and Ivanka are terribly political. And if you're not terribly political, you're going to go along with the herd in your social life. And so I think that they are constantly afraid that Trump is being permanently labeled an anti-Semite or a bigot or a white nationalist. They read all of that liberal press, and they travel in those liberal circles, and they worry constantly about damage to the brand and all of that kind of stuff. I don't think we have to worry too much about that, because Trump's been through so much fire. He's very committed. I mean, the one real upside to this constant hysteria that comes from the media is that it never allows Trump to moderate, because he's so angry at being vilified by them that it keeps him very loyal to us. And I think we're long past the point on that. I mean, I think he has endured this for so long now that he's very loyal to us and these causes as we are to him, because he understands there's no going back. There's not going to be any mea culpa moment with the left and the media. His ships are burned, and he intends to see this through. I just don't think that his daughter and son-in-law are sort of in that same place. The best way to put this, I guess, would be they're focused on post the White House and after he passes away, because he's an older man and he's not going to live forever. They're worried about themselves and the family name and the business and their future beyond that. Trump's very focused on delivering some specific things and getting certain things done. I don't think they ultimately care about.
Well, they certainly don't have a passion for it like their father does.
So when they come in and try to moderate him or complain or try to get him to take a different position, I really don't think it's because they care about the politics. I think it's just selfish. I think it's just them worried about what's going to happen to the Trump ship, the Trump family, after he's gone, after this whole political journey that he's on is over with. So they're just sort of looking out for themselves. And I'm not judging that necessarily one way or another. I sort of understand that instinct. If you're not very political, I understand why they would be that way. Obviously, I don't agree with them, and I want the president to continue on. But I think if you see it from that perspective, it's not so much them trying to undermine him as them just basically selfishly looking out for themselves and their own future, because they're going to live a long time beyond him. And in the circles they travel in, it looks like he's just this meteor, who's going to crater into the earth at some point, and then they're going to be left with all of the damage, having to live in New York with all of these people as his. And I think there is some genuine reason to be concerned on all of our parts. We're going to have to defend this movement going forward, even after Trump exits the stage. Because if we don't, all of the people who oppose us, who have full control of Hollywood and academia and the press, the liberal Companion Heights, they're going to write the history. And believe me, if you think about what happened to McCarthy, they fully intend to continue doing what they're doing right now. They will, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, they will be making the argument that he was a secret white nationalist and a racist, and that this was some dark, horrible chapter in American history. So there's no finish line here, folks. We need to support him while this is going on, but we're going to have to continue to defend the movement going forward, or they will write the history and they will write us right into the Voldemort camp of this whole thing. And I think that is all that Jared and Ivanka think about. They're just panicked that their father's going to be written off as some kind of Darth Vader in American history, and that will affect them and their children going forward. I don't care about that, but I think he has the will to resist that. I think, you had a test example of this with the Paris Accords, where I think their argument probably behind closed doors to him was, all of our friends support this, basically without saying it explicitly. I'm sure their argument was something like, all of elite society thinks that we have to stay in this. How could you possibly go against everyone we go to cocktail parties with? And yet he resisted that and said, no, I'm pulling out of the Paris Accord. So he's shown a willingness to basically say, screw it, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do. And I think they just have to lump it.
Well, it seems to me that they thought Bannon was both too conservative and somewhat uncouth. I mean, he doesn't have the look of the people in their little family, and he doesn't act like a genteel person would. And I think all of those things were against him.
Well, I think there's no doubt, you're right, that he's not someone that they knew until last year, and that he is sort of a barbarian that was let in, a German barbarian that was let into Rome because he's going to be the general they're going to put in charge of going out and defeating the enemy, but he's not somebody they want hanging around at dinner. And I think they always saw him as that type, and I think that they perceived him as a force, and that if they could get him out of the White House, that might increase their control. We'll see. I mean, there is concern, like I said, among some of Trump's supporters that this is part of an ongoing effort of purging the nationalists out of the administration. And I think it's a legitimate concern. We just have to watch it. At this point, I just don't think that we know whether or not Bannon's departure really will allow Trump to drift away from nationalist policies. Because remember, Bannon's now going right back to work to Breitbart. Breitbart's already putting the fire on the president and holding him to his promises. So I'm not sure that Bannon, as editor-in-chief of Breitbart, is a victory for Ivanka and Jared if you define them as the sort of globalists, because he's probably more powerful back, in control of Breitbart, and Breitbart's never going to stop harassing the president as far as trying to keep him on the goals that he promised. He's never going to get let off that hook. So whether he's sitting there in the White House or he's running that 800-pound gorilla that is Breitbart, the president's not going to be able to escape criticism or the pressure that will be on him to fulfill his promises.
Yes.
So I wanted to give a short little Russia hoax update. This whole thing got shoved to the side because these are all just tools. You've long since figured this out. They don't mean any of this stuff. They're not even that worried about Charlottesville. They just saw it, they thought, as something that they could use as a bludgeon against Trump. So notice that they're like a kid that gets a new toy. He loves the truck you've given him, and then the moment this new teddy bear comes along, the truck just gets dropped, and he's over at the teddy bear, and it's like the truck doesn't even exist. You've all seen this with little children. This is how the Democrats are. I mean, they were absolutely 100% that Russia affected the election and Trump's got to be impeached and it's all just horrible, horrible, horrible. And then Charlottesville happens and you don't hear one word about Russia for 2 weeks because all they want to talk about is Charlottesville because they think this is the new bludgeon that they're going to be able to use against the president. They don't mean any of it. It's all false. But I did think it was interesting that the head of Fusion GPS that created that fake Trump dossier last year was brought in front of the Senate committee investigating this whole Russia hoax. And he refused to divulge who had hired him to do that work. Now, he can get away with that in front of the Senate committee. But my thought was Robert Mueller is supposed to be investigating this Russia interference in the election. Clearly, the dossier is a tangible item that was an attempted interference in the election because it was about Trump, and he was one of the two candidates. And it has Russian sources involved in it. At least that's the rumor, and there's reason to suspect that. You would think that an investigator like Mueller would want to know the facts behind this. So my question is he going to subpoena this gentleman? Because he has subpoena power to bring this guy in front of a grand jury and to force him to divulge who his client was. And I think you're going to find out just how serious this all is. I've maintained the whole time that the Russia story is phony and that Mueller's investigation is really just designed to take the president down. But if it were real, he would subpoena this guy. He would bring him in front of a grand jury and he would find out who paid him to create that dossier. So we'll keep our eye on it. I don't really believe he's going to do that, but I just think that the fact that he won't do that or doesn't do that will be further evidence that the Mueller investigation is not sincere.
Well, it's like the trial attorney. He never asks a question that he doesn't know the answer to in advance. So why would Mueller have divulged who this employer was when he probably knows who the employer was and doesn't want everybody else to know?
Well, that would just simply confirm my point that this is not a real investigation and that it's the deep state attempting to take Trump down using the mechanisms of the Justice Department and the American judicial system. So Trump had this speech on Monday where he announced that we would not be nation building in Afghanistan and that we would be there to kill terrorists and that he was going to hold Pakistan responsible for any fighters that move between the two countries. I think there's legitimate concern about the president's Afghan strategy. Ann Coulter's been out there banging away on it ever since it happened. Basically, the president ran on not getting us involved in foreign wars, that these were costly and expensive wastes of money, and that the money should be spent here in the country. That's a core tenet of his nationalist plank. It feels like endless war after 16 years in Afghanistan. Ann Coulter's angry, Breitbart's angry. I share the concern, but as a Trump supporter, I guess my reaction is that I am willing to give the president a very short window to prove that this is an entirely different strategy. So I don't know whether, because he's not giving a lot of details, I don't know whether this is a kind of a Nixonian strategy of a short surge to create some kind of a what looks like a victory so that you can then just pull out, claim victory and get the heck out. That may be what's going on. It may be a very deliberately different strategy and taking it to Pakistan. You've got Sundance over at the conservative treehouse arguing that this is basically just exactly what Trump has been doing with China and others, that he has a very good strategy for essentially putting all of the responsibility for something on an actor, and that it changes the behavior, that he has essentially changed Saudi Arabia's behavior by making them responsible for a lot of what's happening in Iraq and other places, and that he's got the North Koreans back down because he's effectively made that the responsibility publicly of the Chinese, and that what he's doing now with Afghanistan is he's making this a primary responsibility of Pakistan, and that will change behavior. It's a decent argument. I think we just won't know until we see it play out. So my own opinion is that the president has a very short window to show real tangible progress of some kind. I think to define winning in Afghanistan in any classical sense is absurd. There is no winning like that in Afghanistan. I think what do I mean by short window? I would say 6 months. I really don't think he has much longer than that. And that's not a lot of time when you're dealing with military ventures, but after 16 years, I think patience is really thin. So if something really tangible to the public at home begins to appear in Afghanistan over the next 6 months, then I think people like Sundance will be correct. They'll be proven out on this Afghan strategy. But 6 months from now, basically a little bit after the new year, if it appears in any way, shape, or form as if it's just not that different than what's going on right now, and soldiers are continuing to die, I think this is going to be correctly viewed as a betrayal. My sense is the president's instincts have not changed, and that he had to struggle for a long time. I think there was a lot of truth in his speech. If you listen to it, you can hear him basically saying, I haven't changed my mind. I think this stuff's all a waste of time. But I'm convinced that I cannot pull out very quickly because that will create a catastrophe. We watched something like that happen in Iraq, and I can't allow that to happen. So I think he's put his generals on a very short leash. My sense from that speech is that he wanted something very dramatically different from them, and that he expects them to produce results very quickly, or he is going to withdraw from the theater. I just don't think that he's changed his mind on this. I think he's just willing to do a very short experiment to see if they can change the dynamics of the relationships there between China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, those places. And I think he will feel very keenly every single death that occurs there. I think that we have in this president somebody who just absolutely will not tolerate any significant amount of military deaths if he doesn't feel that this is a cause that's worth fighting for and that we are fighting to win. I think one of the implicit promises in his administration is that we won't get involved in any foreign wars, with the obvious caveat that if something extraordinary like a 9/11 or something happened and he were forced to engage somewhere, that we have a president who's not like presidents we've had since World War II, in that he would ask his generals for an obliteration strategy, that he would want a strategy where you can really define winning, and that he would execute that. I just don't believe that Trump is a person who will tolerate this sort of trickle of soldier deaths over time. Something that when you're dealing with people like Bush and Obama, when you're dealing with career politicians, I'm not suggesting that they don't feel for those deaths, but I think they are just more like political calculators in that they offset that in their own rationalizations for the geopolitical reasons for why certain things need to happen. I just think that they can rationalize that to themselves because they think they're part of some elite that's executing long-term strategies for the good of the world or what have you, however it is that they explain it to themselves. And I just don't think that Trump is that kind of person. I think that soldier deaths while he's president, he'll feel guilty about that it just shouldn't be happening.
Well, the most remarkable thing to me about this is that he's giving authority to act on the ground without having to call back to Washington, D.C. and have another Benghazi mess where Hillary was responsible for our boys dying over there.
And I think you see that instinctively. I think we all, because the reason why there's that kind of micromanagement is because politicians live in fear of Abu Ghraib type scenarios or anything where it would be scandalous, Marines shooting and killing, or a bomb accidentally dropped on a madrasa and a bunch of children killed. They're constantly worried about collateral damage or mistakes or soldiers getting out of hand, and then they have to deal with that blowback because they live in fear of the press and all of that. I think Trump just doesn't. And so he's much more willing to unleash the hounds of war because when mistakes are made or innocents are killed, which I think rational people understand is part of warfare, accidents will happen, people will get carried away. War is evil, and evil things happen all the time. And I think Trump has much more tolerance for that. I just don't think he's going to sell anyone out. And when accidents or mistakes or egregious things happen, I think he's just going to rationalize it and just say, look, we're there to kill terrorists. But I just don't think he's going to betray the people in the field. And so that's why he's much more willing to cut them loose, because I think he instinctively understands what can happen, both good and bad, when you do that, and he's just not afraid of it.
And one of the best things about Trump is he doesn't think he has all the answers. He actually listens to experts.
True. He's much more of a CEO in the sense that he's looking for competent people, and if he feels that you're competent, he's going to set you loose to accomplish the task, right? And then, of course, be ruthless in his evaluation. If you aren't exceptional, if you aren't getting it done, he's just going to yank you out and replace you. And I think that's why you see staff changes. People in his orbit, like Reince Priebus and others, who were there to create the relationship with Congress and to get the Obamacare repeal and replace done, didn't get it done. And so in Trump's mind, you're fired. You go, and you're going to get replaced with somebody else. And you're going to constantly see staff shakeups with him, including, I would assume, general shakeups, because Trump is more than happy to put you completely in charge. But then, of course, you have to accept all the responsibility. And if you aren't producing results quickly, he's going to fire you and replace you with somebody else. And he's going to keep doing that until he finds the general or the chief of staff or whatever position it is. He's going to keep doing it until he finds the person who does get it done. It's a very ruthless CEO mentality.
And it's either you're a winner or you're a loser, and there is no in between.
So it's high stakes, and a lot of people don't make the cut, but of course they all volunteer for that. I mean, there's no reason to cry any tears for colonels and generals and high-level political people who want to be cabinet secretaries and the rest, they all understand it's high stakes. And many of them, frankly, in government are used to being able to be very mediocre and to still get well paid and to coast along. So they're going to write tell-all books and they're going to be upset. But the truth of the matter is that at those salary levels and with those responsibility levels, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a president holding you accountable for quick results. And that if you can't actually do that, you do need to move aside, and everybody needs to move aside until the person appears who actually can get it done. I want to talk for a minute about what Trump is up against in D.C. and highlight a couple of things that have gone on recently. So Valerie Plame, who you'll remember as the former CIA officer, she and her husband are big Democrats, and they pretended to be all aghast at being outed in a couple of mainstream media stories, which led to a special investigator, which led to a completely wrong, unjust conviction of Scooter Libby, the vice president's chief of staff. It was all just scalp hunting. So she's not a very good person at all. And she is out there now fundraising to get enough of a stake in Twitter to shut down the president's Twitter account, to demand essentially as stockholders that Twitter shut down the president's Twitter account. Now, it's absurd. She's not raising very much money. It's probably just a way to pay her own bills. I'm sure she's just scamming people. But I'm much more interested in the fact that that's not universally condemned, right? That there's no really horrible reaction from the elites at the idea that there would be a movement to silence the president of the United States. Can you imagine if Republicans had tried to raise money in order to have influence over the radio stations so that they could stop FDR from holding fireside chats, if their argument was that he should not be able to talk directly to the American people? Or if there was some movement to prevent Reagan from going on television, that he's an actor with all of these skills and that this is wrong and that he should not be allowed to go on television and hold press conferences in which he communicates directly with the people. At its core, that's what she's doing. She's essentially saying that the elected president of the United States shouldn't be able to use whatever medium he so desires to communicate with the people of the United States. And there's no backlash against even the idea or the concept behind this. And of course, it's rooted in the fact that there's no peaceful transition of power. They have not accepted the will of the people as far as who they elected as president of the United States. That's why all of these things have an undertone of them that he's not legitimate in some way or another. But I thought that was interesting, that she's out doing that and no one seems to care. And then remember that a couple of weeks ago when the Senate recessed, that the Republicans set it up procedurally so that they were technically not in recess and the president couldn't fill any appointments in his administration. I am not aware in the entire 236-year history of the United States, 235, I'm guessing, so I'm probably wrong on the exact number. I'm not aware of one instance in which the party in control prevented its own president of the same party from doing recess appointments. I don't believe that's ever happened again. And if you believe that the GOP has made peace with Trump or that they can work together on anything, I think you need to relook at that maneuver by the Senate. I'm bringing it up again, even though I know I brought it up in a previous podcast, because this is a serious, serious thing for your own party to do to you. And it is a complete betrayal. And every single Republican senator is involved in that, because I didn't hear one of them object to doing that to their own president of the United States, which means that all 52 members of that caucus are guilty of engaging in that. And frankly, I think that's grounds for each and every one of them to be primaried out of office and replaced, because it is a crime. It's a political crime. It's a betrayal of the highest order to prevent the president from being able to recess appoint when he's in your own party. Democrats have never done that to one of their own, ever. And nor would they. You wouldn't expect them to.
They're not stupid.
Now, I don't think we'll end up having to primary them all, and it's part of the reason why I've said we've got to take Heller and Flake and Corker's political scalp next year. We do not have a primary opponent for Corker right now, and that needs to get solved. But we only need to take a few out before the others, in order to save their own skins, will get right on this. But I don't want you to ever forget that they were part of this betrayal. It should remain a stain on their records forever. even if they begin voting right, you'll know that there's always a bit of falseness to that. And when you're dealing with a snake, you just need to remember that you're always dealing with a snake. On the flake front, I thought it was interesting that Trump met with some Arizona congressmen. I get the sense when he was at the Phoenix rally, I get the sense that everybody sort of understands that Flake is vulnerable and they're worried about Ward in the general election. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next week or two you see one of the congressmen from the state announce that he's running against Jeff Flake, because it looks like the president's willing to endorse an opponent. And I think there may be a desire to have somebody who's a stronger candidate in the general election than Kelly Ward. Now, I have no problem supporting Kelly Ward. I'm simply predicting that I think there may be a tacit agreement to bring another stronger candidate against Flake, which is interesting because it means Trump's still working with some members of the party. It also is sort of a willingness of the GOP to cut one of their own loose in order to hold on to the seat. So I keep our eye on this in the next couple of weeks. We might see some interesting announcements on that. The last item after Valerie Plame and the recess blocking that I saw in the news was the other day McConnell went out to Tulsa, I think he was out in the Midwest somewhere, and met with Donahue, the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and prominent board members of the chamber. A private meeting, but I think to understand what's going on, especially when it comes to immigration and open borders, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is opposed to all of that. They are big open borders folks, and definitely never Trumpers. Never supported him in the primary, not happy about it. I think they fully expected he was going to lose in the general election, and they are one of the main problems that his nationalist agenda has to overcome, because when it comes to rewriting the trade deals and clamping down on immigration, there's no bigger problem on the Republican side than the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I thought it was telling that McConnell's gone off to have a meeting with them, and also not a good sign. But I tell you all of that, I bring all those stories up because I think that it's important to understand that there is this whole plot underneath the surface among Republicans, prominent Republicans, to undermine the President of the United States. Sundance over at Conservative Treehouse wrote a great article about, when is Trump going to actually kind of drop the bomb and go against these Republicans publicly and allow us to begin, encouraging us to take them out. But I want to read a couple of paragraphs from that article that I thought were very telling. He said, Trump has done a remarkable job at drawing out the enemy behind the wire. As both a candidate and a president, Donald Trump has exposed a jaw-dropping number of political deceivers. He's also single-handedly exposed their hidden agenda, or agendas, and proved beyond a shadow's doubt that Republicans were lying about policy and principle for years. And he makes the point that not a single Democrat vote is needed to raise the debt ceiling, avoid a shutdown, and or fund the border wall. President Trump already gave them a budget that reduces $1 trillion in spending. The Republicans in Congress have balked and said reducing spending is not their goal. Those same Republicans are now suing President Trump and trying to force the State Department to spend on U.S. aid and NGOs. Those same Republicans supported omnibus spending bills. Those same Republicans will not support removing Obamacare. Those same Republicans are fighting renegotiated trade deals. Those same Republicans supported launching ridiculous Russian conspiracy investigations, and the list goes on, including Senate Republicans using a strategic maneuver to block their own president from recess appointments. End quote. I don't think we need any further evidence that a wholesale house cleaning has to happen within the Republican Party. It starts with taking those 3 Senate scalps next year. And then, as I've said before, I invite all of you who are active in your Republican parties to get involved in identifying one Republican member of your delegation. If it's the 3 I'm talking about in Tennessee, Nevada, and Arizona, I think they are the ones to concentrate on those states. But in the other states, I would say, look around at your delegation, find the one who is the most anti-Trump, and target him or her for a primary campaign. Take out just one. You can focus your time and your money and your energy and succeed at doing that, and you will actually change the behavior of the others when they see one of their own taken out. If your state's so blue that you don't even have much of a delegation, you might aim at the party chair or even your own county chairs. But we have to engage in this fight because they are dedicated to purging us. All of these never-Trumpers in the party believe that this is a temporary fever and that once they can take down Trump, that they will purge all of the rest of us. And we better start fighting right now. My message to the GOP is this. Trump has proven that you can fight the mainstream media and the narrative. The GOP voters expect that now. And if you won't fight, get off the stage. We're done with obsequiousness. So Doris and I live not too far from the totality, the eclipse that came by the United States. What was this? Monday? It was Monday. And where we live is a little bit outside of the totality at about 97% or so. And we decided that we were going to drive a few miles into the totality so that we could actually watch it. And we did that. And we didn't really have much of a traffic problem at all. So we'd done a lot of preparing and we went hours early, none of which we needed to do. And we got about a minute and I'd say about a minute, 15 seconds or so of the totality. And those who have basically said that if you're not in the totality, you don't really experience the eclipse, they're correct. What we saw, you can only see when you're actually in the 70-mile long shadow. And what happens is essentially the moon completely covers the sun, and when it's during that minute when it's right blocking it, not at 99%, but at 100%, you begin to see the corona around the sun, and it's this sort of erupting silver, silky, wavy stuff that's sort of coming off of the sun at about twice the length of the sun from your visual point. It's those strands going out about 1.5 to 2 times the size of the sun coming off of this thing, with this black circle in the middle because the sun is being blocked by the moon. That's very interesting. And then the other really great phenomenon is that you see a 360-degree sunset. So you can pivot around 360 degrees and see the sort of lit up, dusky sunset, lighted at the horizon. It's lit up all the way around in 360 degrees instead of just in the west normally. And that was kind of fascinating. And then the temperature drops. So it definitely got noticeably colder. And we were hoping to get a little bit more of the night sky. I think we identified Mercury and Venus that we could see a little bit offset from the eclipse itself. But I think Mars might have been too close. And we didn't really... It certainly got darker, but it didn't get so dark that you got like a Montana sky. But that may have been a reflection of where we were. Maybe if we'd been in much, much more rural areas, maybe we would have gotten a slightly better sky. But I thought it was definitely one of those things you should do in your lifetime. And if you're anywhere near totality, you should absolutely experience it. It was fascinating, and it was kind of eerie the way that the whole sky changed as a result of this. Doris, what did you think?
Well, first of all, I felt sorry for the people who thought that 99% totality would be the same thing as full totality, because it wasn't at all. All those people did not see the corona. They did not experience the same things that we did. I thought it was interesting that the crickets started chirping, thinking it was nighttime. The birds quit flying. Our shadows were different than they are normally. It was just a fascinating experience, and one I'm really glad I saw.
Doris and I talked about this at the time, but you can only imagine. We live in the Enlightenment. We have much better scientific understanding of what's happening, but I couldn't help but think about primitive people and our ancestors before they totally understood what was going on, when they were still worshiping the sun as a god, and everything gets personified as a god when you don't understand it. And that's why early religions deified nearly every force or every item around, because if it was fascinating or if it appeared to have some magical power, then it got deified so that it could be worshipped, so that it could be talked to, so that it could be reasoned with, to not kill or not maim or not do bad things, or to provide. And I mean, even in my educated mind, it's such a fascinating, weird thing that's happening in a totality that I thought, boy, in much more ancient and primitive times, you can see why that would be interpreted as a sign, or that something significant is happening, or that you must respond in some way, either through human sacrifice or a journey, or that you must make some kind of a reaction that's commensurate with what you just experienced.
Because you've obviously displeased one of the gods somewhere.
Certainly a message is being sent, and you better receive it. So it does help to understand a little bit about the past, to experience something like that. And I thought that was fascinating. Doris and I this week we saw the Hitman's Bodyguard, and that stars Samuel Jackson and Ryan Reynolds. Doris, your thoughts?
I thought it was preposterous, the battles and all the bullets flying that managed to miss the two main characters. But it was so amusing. The dialogue was amusing that I didn't feel like I wasted my money going to see it.
Samuel Jackson has a certain personality that he's known for, which is kind of amusing. And then Ryan Reynolds also has a kind of a cynical personality and persona that is amusing. And this pairing was a clever idea. They had not been in a movie together that I'm aware of. And they played off of each other very well. That sort of Quentin Tarantino character that Samuel Jackson plays matched up against Ryan Reynolds' cynicism that he's done in a lot. I wouldn't say Deadpool because he wasn't quite that cynical, but it was a good mesh. And it made for some great dialogue between the two of them, some very funny reactions. The movie never really took itself too seriously, so the action was absurd. Yes. Absolutely absurd, but the movie didn't pretend that it wasn't absurd. And so, yeah, I thought it was, it wasn't a great movie. It's totally forgettable, but the quality of movies this year have been so low that this is, you know, if you're just looking for pure escapism and a few laughs, I think this movie definitely provides that.
Exactly. The good movies this year have been Dunkirk, Wonder Woman, and Baby Driver. Those are the only ones I would say that have come out any time in the past few months that are worth anything.
Yeah, it's hard to argue against that. So this is the, what is it, 35?
35th anniversary.
Yeah, 35th anniversary of the release of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And if you check your local listings, you may find that a local movie theater is, I think Fathom Events may be broadcasting it. So Doris and I are planning to go to the theater to watch this. I'm a Trekkie, and so I'm a huge fan of this movie. It's definitely the best Star Trek movie that was made. And I think that, first of all, it contains one of film's best villains in Ricardo Montalban playing Khan. And I just read something that when they were making the movie, William Shatner was not happy that they were pulling a character from the original series because he thought they should just do something new. Why are we pulling something? And he even admitted he's totally wrong and that it was a great idea and that it worked out great. I think the decision to pull from the series could have gone either way, but that worked because the actor. I mean, they had a great character in Khan, and they had introduced him in this episode of Space Seed from the original series, but they allowed themselves. I mean, he became sort of a steroids version of himself in the movie. I mean, they really hyped it up. They made him much more sinister. And it was obviously, it just allowed Montalban to just chew the scenery in the movie. It's a Moby Dick type story because Khan is out for revenge. He feels betrayed by Kirk, and that's all explained. And so there's a lot of quotes from Moby Dick. There's a quote from Tale of Two Cities in the movie. And so it's well written. It's got some great dialogue. The famous Spock death scene in the movie. But I think what drives it, because a lot of the movie is a cat and mouse battle scene between the two of them, which is reminiscent of the old submarine warfare movies. The villain, the relationship between Khan and Kirk is what drives the movie and makes it so fun. And just like with Hans Gruber in Die Hard, what can make a great action film is writers who've taken the time to create a villain who has some level of sympathy and three dimension. When we are delighted by a villain, like a Darth Vader or what have you, when there's a backstory, when we see them as a fully developed character, that is much more engaging. because we do, there a lot of time is spent with the hero as well, and we're obviously very attached to the hero. But when we've also got some attachment to the villain, it makes their life and death struggle that much more engaging for the audience. And Ricardo Montalban has great lines. They've given him great lines in the movie, and he just has a hiss about his villainy, which is wonderful. And it's a great movie, and I think people can enjoy it even if they aren't necessarily Star Trek fans, or even if they haven't seen all the Star Trek movies. It really stands alone on its own, and most people are familiar with Captain Kirk and Spock and the basic characters in the movie.
One of the interesting things you pointed out to me these past few weeks is the Asian influence on movies, and how there are scenes or references that will play well in China and elsewhere.
Yeah, the tentpole movies always have some kind of Chinese reference. What was the movie we saw not too long ago that had a Chinese character in it? It was so obvious that was the Chinese connection. I mean, a movie like The Hitman's Bodyguard, I'd have to think about it. It probably did have something Chinese in it. I didn't notice. But that's not necessarily a tentpole movie. I'm thinking more of like the superhero movies, the movies where they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. They will always have some Chinese connection to them because they're going to make a ton of money over there, and they want a scene that takes place in Beijing or in Hong Kong or something like that, or a Chinese character, or the Chinese government somehow figures into the plot. Somehow or another, they're going to find a way to connect for the audiences over there.
So the question is, are theaters going to go the way of newspapers?
Well, they are struggling. There's no doubt. And I think you and I have noticed it in the theater that the attendance is down. This is turning out to be one of the worst box office numbers for Hollywood in a couple of decades. Now, part of this is their own fault. They have really piled up on the tentpole pictures. They're not making dramas and comedies at the same level that they were before. They're putting all of their eggs in these baskets. People like Spielberg and others warned them that that could really fall on its face. So some of this is about the business decisions that they have made, but the quality is noticeably down. I mean, this entire century, I have noticed the quality down. Television is really where the better stuff is being done. The one thing that Hollywood can do is these big CGI adventure stories, and that's why they've tended to gravitate towards those, because TV can do Dexter and House of Cards. It can do dramas, it can do comedies and those kinds of things. And I think movies have sort of ceded that territory to the episodic television show. But, for instance, you're seeing with Game of Thrones, those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones, the CGI work with those dragons is exceptional. The quality is really, really good. And they're only doing 7 episodes of Game of Thrones because it's clear they're eating up all of their budget in those 7 episodes. They can't even stretch it to 10. There's a major battle scene in every single episode of this season. And the quality is really very good. So television's beginning to take that away from movies, even this ability to tell sort of large stories with battles like Game of Thrones. I don't think that's leaving movies with a lot of room. There's just not a lot left for them to do that television can't provide. So if they don't find, right now they have 3D, which is the kind of the one thing that they can do. But you and I usually will only pay for maybe 1 or 2, 3 at the most movies a year in 3D because it looks like they'll use that well and it's worth the extra cost. I don't think that can sustain Hollywood. I think that you may be right. This may be a transitioning out of theaters over the next couple of decades. We are just about out of time. Remember that you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. So I'm hoping that you will like our show, write a review, and tell a friend. You are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.